I am seeing a lot of denial over the internet as to the general state of the Ukrainian military right now. And the one thing that I hate the most in this world is bullshittery, which is exactly why I am making this video to expose the utter bullshittery of mainstream media, which is still telling us stories about Ukrainian Übermenschen fighters and how they are about to win the whole war. Right now, I am going to show a collage of various pictures and videos that demonstrate some of the equipment that the Ukrainian army uses. And you tell me if this looks like a military which is winning the war. By the way, I am not going to cite any figures regarding losses either for the Russian or for the Ukrainian side because we are in the middle of a war and we shouldn't expect any of these figures to be true. So instead of referencing any kind of official propaganda, I am just going to show a bunch of images and videos that we have seen coming from the front lines, and these images and videos clearly tell a story. So first of all, here you have some guys who took a random civilian pickup truck and welded a machine gun on top of it. Essentially, the same level of technical sophistication that ISIS fighters used during the Syrian civil war. Except, of course, that unlike some jihadi rebels in Syria, Ukraine has the full backing of NATO and the second largest standing army in Europe. And next up we have yet another video of a machine gun welded to the back of some random civilian truck. And here we have yet another one of these pickup trucks with machine guns welded to the rear, except it's been destroyed, and now it appears that the Donbass militia are inspecting it. By the way, you can tell that this is a Ukrainian army vehicle and not a vehicle of the Donbass militias because it has pixelated camo. Only the Ukrainian military uses pixelated camo. The Russian military and the militaries of the Donbass republics don't have pixelated patterns in their camo. And next up we have this wonderful image which shows a bunch of Ukrainian soldiers also in a civilian car. By the way, the reason why you see so many Ukrainian soldiers in civilian cars is because they know that civilian cars are much less likely to get airstriked by the Russian military. So it's not some kind of an exception that these soldiers are going to the front lines, I presume, in a civilian vehicle. This has been a growing tendency for some time. And literally, the first piece of equipment that you see in this car's salon is this Maxim machine gun, which I'm going to get back to. The soldier in the front is holding an RPG-7, which was first manufactured in the 1960s. And I believe that the soldier in the back is holding an AK-74, which is also not the most modern assault rifle. And then, of course, there are the two machine guns. The first one that you see in the rear, it's sort of lying down on the floor, appears to be a DP-27. This is a Soviet machine gun that was first made in the year 1927, so almost 100 years ago. It is a pre-World War II machine gun. And of course, perhaps most notably, there is the Maxim gun, which was also widely used by the Soviet Union during World War II, but of course it was already somewhat outdated at the time. And as I explained in one of my previous videos, the Maxim gun was made during the 19th century. Specifically, it was first manufactured by the British Empire during the 1880s. Now, this machine gun has a long history within the Russian Empire, within the Soviet Union. It was used by many different militaries. And it was, of course, manufactured locally, first within the Russian Empire, then within the Soviet Union. But that was a very long time ago. There are photos of this machine gun being used on horse-driven carts. And I am saying this just to give you an idea of how old this machine gun is, just how outdated it is by modern standards. No modern well-equipped military would ever use such a piece of equipment because obviously there are many far better alternatives out there today. If something like this is being used by a modern military, then the only thing that can be said is that there are very serious shortages of modern fighting equipment. And then you have this video which came out about a week ago. And to be fair, I already showed it in one of my previous videos, but since we're talking about the overall state of the Ukrainian military, this time I am going to show it again. So you have Ukrainian soldiers riding around on bicycles. And the reason that they're doing this is almost certainly because they do not have fuel to power their cars. There's also this picture with a Ukrainian soldier on what appears to be some sort of motorcycle. And then there is this video showing Ukrainian soldiers attempting to transport some of their munitions and equipment on what appears to be a tricycle. And again, this is partly due to a lack of motorized vehicles within the military because most of them have been destroyed from the air. But more importantly, it is because there is no fuel to power said cars in the first place. And here is another very interesting video that sort of piques your attention. It shows Russian soldiers laying out a bunch of confiscated weapons, none of which are modern. Now apparently all of this weaponry has been confiscated from a man in civilian clothing. But as we can clearly see, there is anti-tank weaponry there. These aren't hunting rifles or anything of the sort. These are military-grade weapons, and all of the evidence points towards the fact that they were supposed to be used in the war. And as of the last 2 days, we have received more footage. One shows what appears to be a bunch of teenagers aged perhaps 16 or 17, armed with weapons and being sent to fight the Russians on the front lines. Other footage shows old men, all aged over 60, perhaps even over 65, conscripted into the Ukrainian army and sent to fight the Russians, after which they were rather quickly captured by the militias of the two Donbas republics. In other words, we are getting clear signals of the fact that Ukraine is mobilizing anyone it possibly can, from young teenagers to old men, and sending them to the front lines. Now, tell me that this isn't indicative of a lack of manpower. And we're seeing this situation get progressively worse every single week. It seems that every new week brings more and more footage of this kind. Although it should be noted that this is perhaps at least not yet indicative of the status of the Ukrainian army as a whole. That is to say, not every single unit within the Ukrainian military is like this. Lots of Ukrainian army units still have functioning tanks, they have armored cars, they have armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles. But if all of this footage is anything to go by, not to mention the fact that the Ukrainian government is constantly asking other countries for more equipment, more armored vehicles, more tanks, even the most outdated ones, all of this clearly indicates that even the more rudimentary equipment that a modern military is supposed to have is clearly running out for the Ukrainian army. Keep in mind that we are talking about a country whose military has been trained for 8 years now by NATO specialists from many different countries. This country used to have its own defense industry, which, although was very corrupt, was still by no means insignificant. And I emphasize the word had, because the Russian military destroyed pretty much all of this defense industry within the first 3 weeks of fighting. And this isn't just what I'm saying, this is what the Ukrainian presidential spokesperson has said. And of course, let us not forget the fact that this is a country that was supplied with absolutely ludicrous amounts of all kinds of equipment, primarily by the United States, but also by NATO as a whole. And just now, as of April 13th, we're hearing that the United States has supplied so many Javelin and Stinger missiles to Ukraine that it will take the United States about 4 to 5 years to replenish its own stockpile of these weapons. But on top of that, let us not forget that Ukraine is a post-Soviet country. It was the second largest Soviet republic. And Ukraine inherited an absolutely ludicrous number of weapon systems from the Soviet Union. Besides one of the world's largest navies and air forces, Ukraine also inherited around 6,500 tanks and 7,000 armored vehicles. This is roughly the same as what the United States of America has today. So make no mistake, before February 24th, there were no units within the Ukrainian military that were anything like what we are seeing right now. And right now, I would guesstimate that perhaps around 10 to 20% of Ukraine's total army has been deprived of vehicles, of modern fighting equipment, of fuel and logistics, to the point where it resembles a ragtag band. That is to say, the majority of the Ukrainian army still resembles an actual army. But the longer that this war of attrition continues, the less equipment and the fewer number of trained soldiers the Ukrainian military is going to have, and the more of these absurd videos of Ukrainian soldiers riding around on motorcycles and bicycles and carrying World War II or pre-World War II equipment we are going to see. So anyways, that was the worst of what we've seen from the Ukrainian military so far. Now let me show you something that is a bit more common, where the equipment being used is more advanced than machine guns on pickup trucks, but is nonetheless very far away from what a modern fighting force should have. So first of all, here we have a bunch of old artillery pieces which are being carried by a train, and these are not self-propelled artillery pieces. And someone pointed this out to me. You can tell that these howitzers are very old, judging by the coloration of their camo. These were probably taken out of storage that has been around since the Soviet era and are now being shipped to the front lines to replace the losses that were already suffered. Here are some of the T-72 M1 tanks, which are being donated by Poland to Ukraine, and Poland has announced that they plan on delivering 100 of these tanks along with some other equipment. But the problem is that the T-72 M1 tank is the same tank that was used by Saddam Hussein's forces during the Gulf War. There it was, very famously destroyed by American M1A1 Abrams tanks, which had vastly superior firepower, vastly superior armor, as well as vastly superior optics. So essentially, this equipment was already outdated 30 years ago, and now it's being sent by Poland to Ukraine to fight the Russian military. And of course, the vast, overwhelming majority of Ukrainian main battle tanks that were fielded when this war began were vastly superior in quality to these Cold War antiques. Tanks like the T-64 BVM, of which Ukraine had about 1,000 before this war began, not to mention many other modern variants, are far more advanced and capable than these T-72 M1 tanks. So Ukraine's equipment, which it has on paper and which it officially claims that it still has not lost, it officially claims that this equipment has not been destroyed by the Russian military, is vastly superior in quality to what Ukraine is getting from Poland. So one has to wonder, why is Ukraine begging so many countries so hard to deliver this outdated equipment? Well, the answer is because Ukraine did lose all of its modern fighting equipment. And of course, when it comes to replacing losses, old equipment is better than no equipment. Now take a look at this video. It looks like something straight out of the 1980s. It looks like something out of HBO's Chernobyl movie. Just a convoy of cars that were produced in the Soviet Union during the 1960s, during the 1970s. And again, this is what Ukraine is going to be getting to fight the Russians. And then we also have this video, which shows a naval mine that was discovered inside a damaged vehicle of the Ukrainian National Guard. As it turns out, naval mines make for great improvised explosives. They have explosive charges that are on the order of 100-150 kilograms. But once again, it's not something that a well-equipped and well-supplied military should be even thinking of using as improvised explosives, especially on what appear to be suicide cars. So after seeing all of this, is anybody really going to try to claim that the Ukrainian military is winning the war? That it's the well-geared, well-oiled fighting force that's actively beating back the Russians, like mainstream Western propaganda is telling us? This is not the appearance of a military that is winning its war. It is, if anything, the appearance of a military that is, if not on its last legs, then at the very least, not too far from a military collapse. But I will say this: as long as the West continues to arm Ukraine, to send weapons shipments in these very high quantities, Ukraine will most likely at least not completely run out of weapons. Of course, when it comes to arming a country with heavy weapons, specifically vehicles, but also with Stinger missiles and Javelin missiles, there is the potential to run out of personnel that can operate this equipment. This, by the way, is the main reason why the West is trying to send Ukraine Soviet-era vehicles and heavy equipment, even though it is hopelessly outdated by modern standards. The problem here is that if the West were to send Ukraine something like Leopard 2 tanks or M1 Abrams tanks, then there simply wouldn't be anyone in Ukraine who is trained to operate them. However, since the Ukrainian military was trained to operate Soviet equipment, the West can send them various Soviet equipment from former Warsaw Pact countries which still have stockpiles of this weaponry. But the other problem to add to this is that the number of personnel who are trained to operate Soviet equipment who are in Ukraine are also not infinite in number. You can replenish the fleet of vehicles that a country has relatively easily, but sooner or later there aren't going to be any personnel who are combat capable and who are trained to operate this equipment. And manpower is something that you cannot replace as easily. It takes a minimum of about 6 months to a year to learn how to drive a tank. These personnel are not going to be trained on Ukrainian soil because as soon as Russia gets wind of any training facilities, it's going to bomb them. Now, of course, there is also the option of training these personnel in Western countries and then sending them back to fight in Ukraine, but that is a whole other level of logistical complexity. So long story short, all indicators clearly point towards the fact that the Ukrainian military has suffered enormous losses since February 24th. And any shipments of arms and munitions from other countries, specifically from Western countries, can only do so much to fill in the massive gaps that were made during the battles with the Russian military. Not to mention that said weapons shipments are already reportedly having an adverse effect on Western militaries. We are hearing that the United States has sent so many Javelins and Stinger missiles to Ukraine that it will take the US military-industrial complex about 4 or 5 years to make up the difference. And by the way, US sources have told us that the collective West has sent, collectively, mind you, somewhere on the order of 60 to 70,000 ATGMs and 20 to 25,000 man-portable air defense missiles to Ukraine. But all of these arms shipments cannot compensate for the simple fact that sooner or later Ukraine simply isn't going to have any people who are able to operate this equipment. Now, of course, the West can partly compensate for this by sending mercenaries. A topic that I haven't spent a lot of time talking about is how there were and still are thousands of mercenaries, perhaps even tens of thousands, fighting for the Ukrainian military. But again, this at the end of the day can only do so much to compensate for the lack of manpower, and more importantly, it cannot compensate the fact that the entire military machine as a whole is being destroyed. It is one thing to send a few tanks and have them be destroyed, then send a few air defense systems and again have them be destroyed, and then send a few drones, immediately have them be destroyed, and so on. And it's a whole other thing to have all of this equipment present all at once in one location as a single, well-oiled fighting machine, as this equipment is crewed by well-trained personnel within a professional military. And a professional military is something that Ukraine is soon not going to have. And that is all that I wanted to discuss today. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like. It helps the algorithm, especially if you are watching this on YouTube. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please be sure to check out my Rumble channel, as well as my Telegram channel, the links to which will both be in the video description. And likewise, if you are watching this on Rumble, first of all, thank you. Rumble is an amazing platform. And please be sure to also check out my YouTube channel as well as my Telegram channel. The links to both will be in the video description as well. And with all of that said, I wish you all a wonderful day.